Shalom, once again from Interfaithfulness, where we're building bridges, where history builds walls. This is Rabbi Stuart Dowerman, and I'm here to fulfill a promise that I made. The other day, I went on a prayer walk and gave a little talk that ended up being difficult to hear because the buffering of the Wi-Fi signal as I walked through the neighborhood was uneven and some things got choppy. So I promised I would do it here in front of the red door, and that's where I am. And that's what I'm going to do. I want to talk to you about what's the big idea. This is a very big idea. Worldview. Your worldview and reality. I'm going to tell you 3 stories, give you a definition of worldview, and leave you with some profoundly important questions. So, let's begin with story number 1. Recently, I've been praying about money, not because I like to be rich and not because I'm broke, but because God has touched my imagination with certain things that I need to do. I'm a kind of a visionary kind of leader, and I get ideas that have to be followed. And there's an idea that I have to follow, but in order to do that, I need more money than I'm currently seeing. So I began praying in a new way for money. That's about a couple of weeks ago. Then, a few days ago, I get an email which tells me that there's money waiting for me in a pension fund that I never knew existed. In fact, the other pension from this organization, I had drained entirely years ago. I emptied it out. So I thought that was all there was. But no. There was more money. So my wife and I had to do a bunch of paperwork, as such things are, and Shazam, it had to be done by December 31st. It was, and now that money is at our disposal. It's not making us rich, but it's helping us out. Now, here's the point. Was that just a coincidence? Was that just serendipity? Was that just synchronicity? Or was that an answer to prayer? The answer to that question all depends on your worldview. And I'll tell you more about that after I tell you 2 more stories. Here's another story. Some years ago, there was a woman in my congregation named Vivian, a senior citizen, with her husband Sam. They lived in Canoga Park, California, in a double-wide mobile home. Vivian was a tzaddikat. She was a holy woman. You could always find her with a Bible in her lap, a woman of great prayer, of great faith, a Jewish woman from Russia who was respected by all. She developed arthritis so that she couldn't even walk across her mobile home. So I went there with a woman from my congregation named Esther to pray for Vivian. So there I went, and when we got there, Vivian was sitting on a couch. So I sat on the right, and Esther sat on the other side with Vivian between us. I asked Vivian if she had any oil, because I had meant to bring oil with which to anoint her, which is customary in such situations. I'd forgotten the oil. She said she didn't have any. So I said, okay, I'll pray for you anyway. So I put my hand on her shoulder. I'm inhaling, about to pray, and her right leg jerks out, and she says, I think I'm healed. I thought to myself, silly old woman, I haven't done anything yet. But the next day, she went for a 1.5 mile walk. This woman who couldn't walk across her mobile home went for a 1.5 mile walk. She was healed. Now, maybe she wasn't healed. Depends on your worldview. Maybe it was just a coincidence. I told this story to a woman who was a doctor and also a PhD, very bright woman, who I'd been talking to at that time, not a believer in Yeshua. And when I told her the story about Vivian, she said, well, there are other explanations for that. In her worldview, there had to be another explanation because she didn't believe in the reality of prayer. So she would have said, I'm sure, when you put your hand on her shoulder, she relaxed. Her spine had been out of whack, such as happens with chiropractors' patients. And when you put your hand on her shoulder, she relaxed, and all of a sudden she became realigned, and shazam, now she can walk. But for this woman, whose name was Deborah, That had to be the explanation because it comported with her worldview. One more story. Another doctor, Chauncey Crandall, a cardiologist, graduate of Yale Medical School. Chauncey Crandall is in West Palm Beach, upscale. He's in an emergency room working on a shift in the emergency room, and a man comes in, Jeff Markham, who was not feeling well. He called his boss. His boss said, "You ought to go to the hospital." So he comes. He gets into the waiting room. He collapses on the floor, dead. They take him into the back. They minister to him in every way that you do when you have someone who has just had a coronary incident. They pump his chest. They put the paddles on him. No less than 6 times they try to jolt him, his heart, back into action. But nothing, absolutely nothing. For 40 minutes, they're trying. Finally, his extremities are turning black. His face and his neck are turning black. He's become necrotic. Death has begun to assert itself. His bloodstream, of course, hasn't circulated for 40 minutes. His brain has not had any blood for 40 minutes. He's dead as dead could be. They called Dr. Crandall in, who's on duty at that time, to sign the death certificate. So Dr. Crandall looks at his watch. He signs the death certificate. He examines the man, of course, and signs the death certificate. He's on his way out of that room, and a voice says to him, "I want you to go back and pray for that man." He thinks to himself, "Lord, he's dead. He's deader than dead. He's really dead." And the voice says, "I want you to go back and pray for that man." So Crandall turns around, goes back through the doors. The nurse looks at him. The nurse is washing the body of the deceased, preparing him to be put into the morgue. And she looks at Dr. Crandall, puzzled. "Dr. Crandall, what are you doing here?" And Crandall then really surprises her. He puts his hands on the chest of the man, and he prays a short prayer. "Lord, if this man doesn't know you, I pray you would bring him back from the dead." He does that, and then he says to the other doctor who had been taking care of this man and using the paddles to shock him, he says, "I want you to jolt him one more time." And the other doctor says, "Dr. Crandall, it's no use. He's dead. Do it for me, out of respect for me." So the doctor puts the paddles on Jeff Markham's chest. He jolts him one more time. Instantly, perfect heartbeat. His chest starts to move. The nurse starts to scream, "Dr. Crandall, what have you done?" She feels like she's in the presence of Frankenstein's monster. Things like this do not happen. It's not part of her worldview. They put the man in intensive care for 3 days. After 3 days, he wakes up. All of his faculties are there. No brain damage. He's got some numbness in his feet and in his hands, which had become necrotic. And he's still alive. Now, here's the point. Did he die, and was he brought back from the dead? Your answer to that question is based on one thing. It's based on your worldview, on what I call the of courses of our culture, the of courses. I'm going to give you a definition of worldview. It's based on the writings of one of my professors who taught me a lot, and Charles H. Kraft. And he's written a lot on this subject. And here's what he says. Charles H. Kraft defines worldview as the culturally structured assumptions, values, and commitments underlying a people's perceptions of reality. Again, a worldview is the culturally structured assumptions, values, commitments underlying a people's perception of reality. Worldview is the major influence on how we perceive reality. Now, notice reality is in capital letters. What we're talking about here is not subjective reality, but reality as God sees it. Objective reality. What is really there. Worldview is the major influence on how we perceive what is really there. In terms of its worldview assumptions, values, and commitments, a society structures such things as what its people are to believe, how they are to picture reality, how and what they are to analyze, and also what is real and unreal, what is possible and not possible. All of these things are structured by worldview assumptions. People interpret and react on this basis reflexively without thinking. In shorthand, I would say that worldview is a term we use for the of courses of culture. Of course the man wasn't dead. Everybody knows that people don't come back from the dead. Of course that money that came in at a perfect time, shortly after I started praying for it, of course it was only a coincidence, because those things just don't happen. Of course Vivian's spine got realigned when I put my hand on her shoulder, because she relaxed in a new way, because we all know that God doesn't heal. Or does he? Your perception of what is possible and what is not possible, of what is real and unreal, is based predominantly on your worldview. So I want to leave you with this. As you read the Bible, allow it to challenge your worldview. I encourage you to have the chutzpah, or maybe it's not chutzpah, courage is better. Have the courage to believe big things of God. Otherwise, your reading of the Bible is just an exercise in antiquarian interest, and it's pretty much a waste of time. So, may your worldview be one that views reality as God sees it in a way that is similar to how God sees it. That's all I got to say today from Interfaithfulness, where we're building bridges, where history builds walls, and where we still pray for people who are sick and are not surprised when astonishing things happen. Bye-bye for now.